I love coming to Harvey. My third Tea Party here. I love Rick gives me the opportunity to be on his program on a regular basis, which is always a lot of fun. I think it's great to hear so many. I was actually, when I was driving down here, I was thinking of what I was going to say. And that's really what I wanted to bring out, and I'm glad Rick's already brought it up. Gene brought it up in his prepared speech. I think what's great is that the Tea Party it's not just about this election. You know, we're talking about Obamacare. Obamacare was a set of laws. It's not just the insurance mandate. It's not just the 1099s. It's not just the nationalization of student loans, which, by the way, I don't know how many of you have even been following what that's doing to the Bank of North Dakota right now. 80% of the Bank of North Dakota's business was student loans. A lot of that business is going away now. Because essentially, if you want to get a student loan, if you want to finance higher education in this country right now, you pretty much have no choice but to go through the federal government. And of course, we all know that unless you're rich, pretty much you can't get a higher education without financing it at this point. The same thing's true of mortgages. According to the Wall Street Journal, 9 out of 10 new mortgages issued in this country right now are either secured or owned by the federal government, by the taxpayers, by you. Which really was the problem to begin with. I saw where Senator Ken Conrad was just talking to the state's editorial boards, saying that TARP was necessary, that we had to do it, that he was in the room when all these other nations were calling, and they were talking about their economies were collapsing. And the government had to jump in there and had to do something. The problem was that the government was the problem to begin with. You've got to ask yourself, whatever you may think about banks making profits, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Wall Street is a center of virtue. They're not. They're for profits. And profits aren't a bad thing, but sometimes they're profits at any expense. So I'm not here to defend them, but I'm telling you, there's a reason why banks give loans to people who have a low probability of paying those loans back. And the reason why they did that is because the government created the subprime mortgage market to begin with. They used Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to securitize those loans. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the reason why the banks went out and made those loans in the first place is because the government said, hey, if you don't make them, we're going to come in and we're going to sue you for being discriminatory in your lending practices. Of course, what the banks were doing were discriminating against people who couldn't pay, which everybody does. I actually heard Barack Obama say that one time in a speech where he said he was going to stop the insurance company practice of allowing insurance companies to discriminate against people based on their ability to pay. And my response was that even Barack Obama discriminates against people based on their ability to pay, because the last time I checked, he wasn't selling his best-selling novels. He wasn't giving them away, right? He was discriminating based on people's ability to pay. If you can't afford the book, you don't get one. That's how it works. Grocery stores discriminate against people based on their ability to pay. Plumbers discriminate against people based on their ability to pay. It's how the world works. But yet, if you're the government, you can come in and you can turn everything on its head and say it's going to work this way because we're the almighty and powerful federal government and we say so. And that's been the problem. And the beautiful thing about it is that more and more the Tea Parties aren't buying this anymore. I just read Earl Pomeroy's in a lot of trouble. The Minot Daily News had a headline yesterday or today saying that it's neck and neck. Baloney. It's not neck and neck. Earl Pomeroy has led, Rick Berg has led in every single independent poll conducted in this election. Not the polls that Earl Pomeroy paid for out of his campaign money. Not those polls. Those polls Earl Pomeroy's led. But of course, he won't allow us to see what questions he asked to get those results. So I discount those. Earl Pomeroy also leads in the Prairie poll, which was only taken in like 6 communities in the state, specifically avoided the larger communities. And oh, by the way, 3 of the communities were on the Indian reservations that vote 90% Democrat every election year. Now, their opinions are as valid as anybody else's opinions, but I don't think a place that votes 90% Democrat is representative of the state as a whole. So, looking just at the Rasmussen polls, which has been the only independent, transparent polling done in this race in the country, Berg is blowing him away. The trend is something like a 7-point lead. The New York Times actually says Berg has an 81% chance of winning this election. Berg has won. I think it's true. I think at this point it's just, now still go vote. Don't stay at home. But I think at this point, I think the race is over, and I think they know it. If you look at the tone of what they're doing, I just got an email from a friend of mine who attended a meeting of, I'm forgetting the acronym for but it was a meeting of financial and insurance advisors. Earl Pomeroy addressed them, they asked him some tough questions about Obamacare, and Earl Pomeroy lost his cool. He got angry. He walked out on him, as a matter of fact. At the Prairie Public debate. How many of you watched the Prairie Public debate on television? Yeah. How angry was Earl Pomeroy? Has anybody seen that side of Earl Pomeroy before? I haven't. It was amazing. Senator Dorgan wrote a letter to the editor defending Earl Pomeroy, and he said all this political dissent, it sounds shrill to him. All this political dissent sounds like nails on a chalkboard to Byron Dorgan. And I tell you what's happening is for the first time in these people's political lives, they are being held accountable. While they weren't looking, while they were serving in Washington, D.C., while they were spending all their time coming back here to North Dakota, putting on their jeans and their plaid shirts, and posing next to tractors for pictures, and then hopping back into the $1,000 suits and flying back to Washington, D.C., the world changed around them. And what changed is we have the internet now. Well, we always had an alternative. For a while, we had talk radio. It's been around a lot longer, but the internet has changed the way politics work. We can read newspapers now in Washington, D.C. We could read the Hill newspaper, which is probably one of the best newspapers in the world, but before, unless you got a subscription and had to mail it to you on a regular basis, you couldn't read it. Now you can pull it up on your cell phone and read it right now. Every single thing that happens in Washington, D.C. If Earl Pomeroy gets accosted on the street and calls the president a clown, somebody can upload it to the internet and millions of people can view it. That has changed. They can't be somebody in North Dakota and somebody else in Washington, D.C. anymore. And every time somebody talks about it, everybody talks about that contrast between how Senator Dorgan talks in North Dakota or how Senator Dorgan talks in Washington, D.C. or what Earl Pomeroy does in North Dakota or what Earl Pomeroy does in Washington, D.C. Every time that happens, it sounds like nails on the chalkboard to Byron Dorgan. Because it's the truth. And for years they've been able to facilitate this charade where they're one person there and another person here, and that has ended. And a lot of it has to do with the Tea Party, too. I think the Tea Party is a movement that was inspired by anger over people finally being confronted with this reality. People had had enough. This doesn't make any sense anymore. It doesn't pass the smell test. And it's a beautiful thing that it's happening, but the thing is it needs to keep happening. Because as much confidence as I have in Rick Berg to go to Washington, D.C., and Rick Berg's not perfect. There's going to be some, there's never going to be a perfect candidate. As much confidence as I have in him going to Washington, D.C., he needs to be held accountable too. And if he strays from the path, if suddenly we forget these calls about repealing Obamacare, if we forget these calls about the bailouts, about the government not being able to stimulate the economy, because the government can't stimulate the economy, the government can't spend anything without either taking money directly from you or taking money away from future generations of Americans by borrowing it from somebody else against their future prosperity. The government can't stimulate the economy. If we send these Republicans to Washington, D.C. and they forget that, then we're going to switch. And if Democrats are the default alternative, that's probably what will happen. Not that they'll be the fix any more than the Republicans were, but that's where we need to get. I firmly believe that starting in 1996, we have seen a flip-flop, 2006. We have seen a flip-flop back and forth between the two parties because we're not satisfied with them. We went from Republicans to Democrats starting in 2006 and 2008. We're going back to Republicans now because the Democrats never had a mandate. I don't think they ever had a mandate to pursue liberalism. I think they carried on as though they had a mandate. I think they thought that Obama was elected, Newsweek had a cover, said we're all socialists now. I think they legitimately believed it. The opinion page of the Grand Forks Herald said that fiscal conservatives may as well go jump in the lake now because the time of Reagan is over. No, it wasn't. The Democrats were just a default, and they were winning elections by default. And Republicans got to be careful because they have got to give us something to vote for. Because if all they're doing is winning elections by default, then their majority isn't going to last long enough. And so that's what we need to do. This movement needs to stay alive. You need to keep caring, not just during election years, but every year. Every time there's a bill before Congress. It might be some really obscure bill that you're not even that sure about. Well, find out. Educate yourself. One of the most beautiful things about this, Byron Dorgan talks about nails on the chalkboard. You know what it was? It was the lady on the video on the internet in Castleton, North Dakota, who's standing there with a copy of the health care bill in her hands, saying, no, you're not telling us the truth, Byron. It says it right here. I downloaded this off the internet. I know. You can't fib to us anymore. You can't come back here in North Dakota and tell us one thing when something else entirely is true. That is the level of accountability we need to have. And it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of work. But we're going to have to pay attention. And I hope we do. Thanks.